One of the most studied topics in archaeoastronomy is the orientation of churches, especially medieval ones. Defining the axis of the church as the line that joins the entrance and the apse, and measuring its orientation as the angle between the north and the altar, we find that most of them face the east. The rule of medieval origin, first expressed by St. Augustine and then sanctioned by the apostolic constitutions, wants the faithful to face the east to pray, in particular towards the equinox. The reason is purely symbolic. The rising of the sun in the east is seen as a metaphor for the light of Christ who returns on Judgment Day, the so-called Sun of Justice. It was also necessary to avoid the solstices, as they were linked to pagan festivities. In Europe, and in the Mediterranean area in general, we find various customs linked to the historical period, the availability of land for construction, and the local history. The very first churches, those of Byzantine and Romanesque art, strictly respect the imposed rules. In particular, it was established that the priest had to turn his back to the congregation, and everyone had to face the east. Therefore, the altars were oriented facing the east, starting from about the year 1000. However, it was not a generic east, but the point on the horizon at which the sun rose on the day of the equinox. But which equinox? There are several possibilities. It wasn't always the astronomical equinox, set by the Council of Nicaea of 325 between March 20 and 21. More often, it was the equinox of the Roman Rite, set on March 25 and coinciding with the Feast of the Annunciation. Starting from the 13th century, in Europe we have the spread of Gothic art, in its different variants. The orientation remains towards the east, with the rise of other possible dates used for the orientation of the apse, such as Easter Day, or holidays related to local cults and pilgrimages. In the 14th century, it was still recognized that the east orientation helped with the calculation of liturgies. In the following centuries, the rules became less rigid, the orientations more varied, and from the 18th century, we see the tendency to orient the apse according to the day of the patron saint of the church in construction, or even according to the day of the beginning of the works. In this video, we will conduct a preliminary archaeoastronomical analysis to see how these rules were applied in Iglesias. Today, Iglesias is a town in South Sardinia, but in the Middle Ages it was a medium-sized village which had a notable growth between the 13th and 14th centuries thanks to mining works. The first mention of Iglesias, at the time Villa di Chiesa, dates back to the mid-13th century, but the presence of older churches suggests that there was already a small local settlement. After the fall of the Judicature of Cagliari in 1258, Villa di Chiesa fell under the direct control of Pisa, with the administration of the Count Ugolino della Gherardesca. He began the construction of the defensive wall and several Gothic churches. In 1323, Villa di Chiesa became the target of the first attack by the Catalan-Aragonese troops at the beginning of the War of Conquest of Sardinia by the Crown of Aragon. Villa di Chiesa surrendered after a 7-month siege, marking the beginning of a period of strong Catalan influence in the arts, society, and language. Despite various rebellions and uprisings, Iglesias was named Royal City, therefore not given in fiefdom but under the direct control of the King of Aragon. From 1420, the whole of Sardinia remained firmly within the Aragonese and then Spanish orbit, until the separation in 1720, but the Spanish cultural influence persisted even in the following decades. In Iglesias, we find several churches from different historical periods. Among the oldest, of Byzantine origin, we find the Church of the Most Saint Saviour, the current Church of Our Lady of Graces, and the Church of Saint Anthony the Abbot. During the Pisan Age, we find the church, now Cathedral, of Sainte Claire, the Church of Our Lady of Valverde, and the disappeared Church of Sainte Lucy. In the Catalan period of early 14th century, we find Saint Francis. At the end of the 15th century, we find the Oratory Church of Saint Michael. In even later epochs, in late Gothic style, we find the Church of Saint Joseph, the Church of Saint Dominic, the Oratory Church of Saint Marcel, and the disappeared Church of Saint Sebastian. The first church we encounter is a Byzantine Church of the Most Saint Saviour. Its foundation date is uncertain, but it's placed at most around the 10th and 11th centuries, therefore preceding the construction of the wall of Villa di Chiesa, with respect to which it is located outside. It's one of the oldest churches, if not the oldest, and it's of fundamental importance because it presents an architectural style that recalls Byzantine and therefore Greek art and Roman liturgy. Let's remember that, following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Sardinia remained under the control of the remaining Eastern Roman Empire, as part of the Exarchate of Africa, which used the Greek Christian liturgy. We have then several centuries of lack of sources in the history of Sardinia, which was cut off from communications with Byzantium by the arrival of the Arabs in Sicily and in the Mediterranean Sea. We know that in Sardinia, an indigenous form of government developed, with the Judicates, and from various inscriptions in Greek, we know that the Greek liturgy remained for some time, to be later replaced by the Roman Rite. The Church of the Saviour presents a style that still recalls Byzantine art, but with a Latin cross plan and not a Greek one, a sign of the beginning of the transition. It was recently restored and it was saved from ruin. The walls are not exactly perpendicular, so more accurate instrumentation would be necessary to exactly estimate the orientation, but interesting results can already be obtained from measurements on map. To determine the orientation of the church, we must measure the azimuth, that is, the angle between the north and the altar, and the height of the horizon. In the case of the Church of the Saviour, the visual to the east is basically completely free, as it opens onto the Cigeri Valley. We obtain an azimuth of about 95 degrees, slightly shifted to the south of the east, corresponding to a declination of about -4 degrees. By definition, the astronomical equinox corresponds to a declination of 0, but we should remember that the Julian calendar, in use in the Middle Ages and in force since the Roman era, was by then out of phase of several days. We should therefore not expect to find a declination of 0, but a value shifted towards +4 degrees. In our case, however, we find a slightly lower declination value. This recurrence has been observed in several Byzantine churches in the Greek area. The Church of the Saviour is therefore oriented according to the autumn equinox, which, for the Greek Rite, fell on September 21, and for the Roman Rite, on September 24. The declination of -4 degrees appears closer to the Roman autumn equinox, around 1100. The Church of Our Lady of Graces is already mentioned in the Breve di Villa di Chiesa, but with a different title that will remain for several centuries. It was the Church of Saint Saturn, a martyr from Cagliari and patron saint of the same city. The current building is of Romanesque foundation, but it could have been built over an older church, from the Byzantine era, which could therefore be counted among the oldest. Even this one was built before the construction of the city walls, and on a rather high hill. We can therefore imagine that at the time of construction, the view towards the east was completely free. The current church has undergone several revisions in the Aragonese and then Baroque eras, without altering its plan. The orientation of the current building has an azimuth of 87 degrees, corresponding to a declination of plus 2 degrees. It is therefore an absolutely canonical orientation, even if it is closer to the date of the equinox set by the Council of Nicaea on March 21st. There remains the possibility that the orientation was inherited from an older building. The third church of Byzantine origin, that stands a short distance from the historic center of Iglesias, is the church of St. Anthony the Abbot, outside the walls and older than the foundation of the city. It's mentioned in the Breve di Villa di Chiesa, but the date of its foundation is totally unknown. It's located on challenging ground, surrounded by mountains that block the view on almost all sides. We know, though, that rivers flowed in this area, towards the water sources that were later channeled towards Iglesias. This church has also undergone major renovations, but the presence of the three original apses on the north side demonstrates that the orientation has not changed. St. Anthony the Abbot's orientation is anything but canonical. The altar is oriented slightly west of north, with an azimuth of about 351 degrees. The reason for this choice is not known. It could have been a forced choice due to the land on which it's built, which places it almost as if it were guarding the entrance to the valley. However, we must remember the importance of the cult of St. Anthony the Abbot in Sardinia. Celebrated on January 17, it marks the beginning of the carnival period. For the occasion, large bonfires are lit to symbolize the return of light over the darkness of winter. The north is the only cardinal point that is never exposed to the sun. Consequently, the altar of the church always remains in the dark. The orientation may therefore be a coincidence, but the hypothesis that it derives from a choice linked to lighting effects cannot be excluded, such as the exit from the darkness of the church towards the light of the bonfires lit in the square. In 1259, Villa di Chiesa passed under the control of Count Ugolino di Donoratico della Gherardesca. Among his first works, there is the construction of the Church of Sainte Claire, dedicated to the Saint of Assisi, just a few decades after her death. The church, built in Tuscan Gothic style, does not have a certain foundation date, but there are two inscriptions that give us a very precise idea. The first was located on the left side of the church and dates back to 1284. The second is located on the facade and dates back to 1288 at the latest. The originals are now in the Diocesan Museum, but their positions suggest that the church was built, as usual, starting from the apse towards the front. Sainte Claire has undergone major renovations since the 16th century, when it became cathedral for a short time. The new roof, in late Catalan Gothic style, and the enlargement of the presbytery have not altered the orientation of the 13th century church, of which the side walls remain unchanged. Renovation works have revealed the original plan, whose apse still exists underneath the current balustrade of the presbytery. Even from a quick glance, we notice how the orientation of the apse is shifted towards the north of east. We measure an azimuth of about 75 degrees, corresponding to a declination of about 13 degrees. Simulating the sky around 1283 using stellarium, we see that this declination value is compatible with the position of the rising sun during the Easter period. In particular, it's very close to the date of April 18, 1283. Sainte Claire therefore appears to be aligned with the trend of orienting churches according to the Easter rank, so that on the morning of Easter Day, the sun could have been seen rising in line with the altar, a phenomenon that can no longer be observed due to the closure of all the windows on the apse. Contemporary to the Church of Sainte Claire is the Church of Our Lady of Valverde. We don't know the exact date of its foundation, but already from a glance at the facade, we can notice the stylistic resemblance to the current Cathedral of Sainte Claire. In fact, even Our Lady of Valverde is built in Tuscan Gothic style of Franciscan craftsmanship. The church stands outside the city walls, which were already under construction, and on a hill, in a position of control over the access routes to the villa. The construction of the church outside the walls was therefore deliberate. The current building underwent several changes with time, the restoration of the vault in late Gothic style and modifications to the apse. Like Sainte Claire, Our Lady of Valverde is oriented north of east, with an azimuth of around 64 degrees and a declination of around 23 degrees. There is, therefore, a difference of 10 degrees in azimuth compared to the cathedral, an appreciable difference that is difficult to explain as an error, especially given the open view to the east that the site must have had at the time of the construction. The difference is so that Our Lady of Valverde is not compatible with the Easter rank anymore, but it's much closer to the summer solstice, which medieval rules asked to avoid. Let us remember, though, that around 1280, the summer solstice fell around June 15th, due to the Julian calendar mismatch. But the orientation of Our Lady of Valverde can have other explanations, such as an orientation towards St. John the Baptist, which is celebrated on June 24, or other festivities linked to Easter, such as Pentecost or Corpus Christi. Among these, several fell in the first half of June during the period of foundation of the church. The orientation towards St. John is not reflected in the dedication of the church, while the connection with some of the Easter holidays is closer to what was seen in Sainte Claire. Both for Sainte Claire and for Valverde, the churches of St. Francis of Stampace and Our Lady of the Port in Cagliari are recognized as inspiration. Unfortunately, neither one currently exists, and it's not possible to take measurements. The dating of St. Francis of Stampace has also been questioned, dating the church, until now believed to be of Pisan foundation, back to the Catalan period of Cagliari. Although it's no longer possible to identify its plan, historical pictures show how it stood next to the current ruins of the convent, in line with what is now Corso Vittorio Emanuele. The road and the surrounding buildings show a northwest-southeast orientation, which we will see was preferred in Iglesias in the Catalan-Aragonese period. Our Lady of the Port, of Pisan foundation, stood at the foot of the Bonaria hill. In more recent times, it was dedicated to Saint Bardilio, but it was later destroyed during the construction of the cemetery of Bonaria. It's now difficult to reconstruct its exact position, but its orientation could be the key to verifying whether it was the same Pisan workers who built the two churches in Iglesias and those in Cagliari. The last medieval church mentioned in the Breve of Villa di Chiesa is Sainte Lucy, with its hospital. The church no longer exists, but it was located along the ancient Via Larga, where private buildings now stand. The church was founded by a Pisan man and survived until the 18th century. Saint Lucy no longer exists, but we can have an idea of its orientation by studying the buildings that stand in its place. The orientation is once again north of east, with an hypothetical azimuth of about 58 degrees, corresponding to a declination of about 25 degrees. The orientation, therefore, would fall just 2 degrees outside the solar rank. Consequently, it cannot be linked to any sunrise, but it's very close to the summer solstice. We are now in the middle of the city, and it's difficult to accurately estimate the height of the horizon, especially because we do not know the distribution of the buildings in the medieval era. The first map of Iglesias dates back to the late 18th century, and it is therefore not possible to say how much the builders were forced by the distribution of the streets, and how much the view of the horizon was covered. However, a northeast orientation is confirmed for the churches of Pisan age. In 1324, Villa di Chiesa fell definitely into the orbit of Catalan influence. The first church, founded by the Catalans, is the Church of St. Francis, built in Catalan Gothic style. Its foundation dates back to around the 1320s by Franciscan workers from the Crown of Aragon, who built the church on so far unused land and near the walls. Even St. Francis has undergone various changes over the centuries, the remaking of some parts of the roof, and the new chapels, and in particular, there are important variations in the layout of the windows that have permanently altered the internal lighting. Unlike what was previously seen, the orientation of the Church of St. Francis is towards the south of east, with an azimuth of about 137 degrees, corresponding to a declination of minus 33 degrees, subject, however, to the presence of the walls now blocking the view from the apse. The Church of St. Francis is therefore oriented closer to the winter solstice, but it exceeds it even, ending up outside the solar rank. It's something new among the churches of Iglesias of the time, but it's not entirely out of place. A direct comparison can be made with churches of Catalan Gothic style found in Barcelona. The orientation towards the south of east is shared by the Cathedral of Barcelona, by Santa Maria del Pi, by the Palatine Chapel of Santa Agata, and by Santa Maria of Pedralbes, all examples of Catalan Gothic. In particular, the Cathedral of Barcelona is oriented towards a declination of about minus 30 degrees, in line with the old Roman town of Barquino. This value is thought to be inherited exactly from the Roman town. The reason for the orientation of the Church of St. Francis is therefore probably to be searched for among the Gothic churches of Catalonia. A few steps from Sainte Claire stands the Oratory Church of St. Michael, whose history has always been linked to the Arciconfraternity of the Holy Mount. Although the exact date of its foundation is not known, the church already existed at the end of the 15th century, placing it among the last churches of medieval origin. It was built in the late Gothic style that remained in vogue in Iglesias until the 16th century and beyond, but the facade was never finished. It stands on a slightly sloping ground and in the middle of the town. The plan is irregular, but the position of the altar is almost to the south, with an azimuth of about 166 degrees, aligned with the road. Not knowing the map of the buildings of the time, we cannot know how much they determined the choice of the orientation of the oratory, but it was likely a forced choice. However, the Church of St. Michael was born mainly as an oratory, and we don't know how strict was the application of orientation rules for this type of buildings. In the 16th century, Cardinal Borromeo wrote down all the rules for the orientation of churches, and he mentions that in the case it was impossible to orient a church to the equinox, it was preferable to orient it to the south. In this sense, St. Michael still respects the canons of the period. But there's another interesting fact. In 1727, the Chapel of the Mysteries was built on land owned by the Brotherhood, with the aim of hosting the simulacra used during the processions of the Holy Week. The chapel is built in such a way that its axis has an azimuth of around 75 degrees, corresponding to 12 degrees of declination, a value that we have already encountered for the Church of Sainte Claire, oriented according to the Eastern rank. In the case of the Chapel of the Mysteries of the Church of St. Michael, the closest date to the 12 degrees of declination is that of April 21st, 1726. Due to the presence of the road, however, the chapel opens onto the west side of the church, with the altar on the same side. In this case, then, we don't have an altar to the east and the rising sun above it, but an altar to the west, with the light of the rising sun illuminating it in the morning from the front. The presence of the body of the church would have posed a problem in determining the orientation of the chapel. In this sense, we have a clue in favor of this orientation hypothesis in the window on the east side of the church, right on axis with the chapel. From this window, sunlight would have enlightened the church in the days around Easter, aligning better with the altar when Easter falls around April 20. This phenomenon can't be observed anymore due to the presence of the palace of the bishop, which now covers the view. The Church of Sainte Lucy no longer exists, but next to it there was another church that inherited its orientation. It is the Church of Saint Joseph. Founded between the 16th and 17th centuries, it was built in late Gothic style. Rising next to Saint Lucy, with which it existed simultaneously until the mid-18th century, its orientation, now measurable, reflects that of the previous church. The azimuth of the axis of Saint Joseph is in fact about 59 degrees, and as for Saint Lucy, it falls just outside the solar rank. Its orientation, which therefore reflects the trends of the Pisan era, is purely due to the buildings already present on site, and to the presence of Saint Lucy itself, of Pisan foundation. The Church of Saint Dominic was built in the 17th century by the will of Niccolò Canavera, citizen of Iglesias and Bishop of Alghero, whose death dates back to 1613. Saint Dominic is built in late Gothic 17th century style, on a previous church dedicated to the Holy Trinity, of which, however, we know little. It's now incorporated among the houses, and its original presbytery was even cut to allow the construction of the Via Eleonora, which stands right on the other side. The view is largely obstructed by the hill of Monte Altari and the mountains of Marganai, having an unobstructed view only to the south and southeast. Saint Dominic is in fact oriented towards the south of east, with an azimuth of about 112 degrees and a declination of -8 degrees, that is, aligned with the sunrise in early March or mid-October. It's therefore not aligned with the equinoxes, nor the solstices, nor the Easter rank. It's not even aligned with the day of Saint Dominic, or the Holy Trinity. It's difficult to understand the reason for its orientation. The nearest festivity is that of Our Lady of the Rosary, on October 7, with a declination of -6 degrees. Our Lady of the Rosary is linked to the Dominican order, and the Church of Saint Dominic itself was the seat of the Confraternity of the Rosary. Further research into its foundation, the confraternity, and the pre-existing churches could provide further clues about its orientation. Saint Marcel was an oratory of the Confraternity of the Crucifix. than of Saint Marcel, of Franciscan affiliation. In fact, it stood next to the Church of St. Francis, already at the beginning of the 17th century, but it was moved at the beginning of the 20th century to allow the construction of the boys' school. It's no longer possible to take measurements on the original building, but the current one shows the same alignment as the Church of St. Francis, with an azimuth of about 138 degrees. The current entrance to the oratory is on the south side, that is, on the road, but historical sources report that the entrance to the original building was on the north facade, therefore, with the altar facing southeast. Whether the choice of the orientation was dictated by the presence of the Church of St. Francis or it was a deliberate choice, St. Marcel also aligns itself according to the southeast orientation of the Catalan Gothic churches of Iglesias. Another church, now disappeared, in late Gothic style, is that of Saint Sebastian, located in correspondence with the current municipal library, and outside the walls and one of the city gates. It's not possible to derive the orientation of the apse, but it can be noted that the Via Crocifisso also has a northwest-southeast orientation. There is another church within the historic center. It's the Church of the Purest Conception, commonly called Collegio, because of its foundation by the Jesuits. The current building, oriented to the northeast, dates back to the 16th century, but it was built on the old medieval city palace and close to the court of the captain. Civil buildings, therefore, that could mislead the analysis. We have seen how the oldest churches, those of Byzantine or Romanesque origin, are oriented towards the east, except for one case that requires a little more attention. Over time, the Gothic churches of Byzantine foundation prefer an orientation to the north of east, towards Easter or related holidays. With the arrival of Catalan Gothic, an orientation to the south of east is preferred, even outside the solar rank, a choice already seen in some churches in Barcelona. Already in the 15th century, the rules became more flexible, with St. Michael, which is oriented towards the south, but with the late recovery of an eastern orientation for the Chapel of the Mysteries. Finally, St. Dominic, in accordance with the southeast alignment, could be a case of orientation according to a particular festivity or patron saint.